Well, it's a pleasure to be here. That's a spectacular ceiling, by the way. I feel sad that billiard tables were taken out of this room for me to be able to speak in it, but what a great building. So I am here to talk about not research. I'm here to talk about why we do research, who we do it for. I'm actually pleased to see so many young faces in the room, because really what I'm talking about is the future of our profession, the future of our craft, your future, the world you're going into. Can I get a show of hands? How many people are doctoral students in the room? Wow, great, okay. I'm going to talk about what we do as professors, why we do it, who we do it for. And I'm going to give you the punchline at the beginning, in case you fall asleep in the middle of my talk. And that is that academia is facing a crisis of relevance. There are significant numbers of people who do not care what we do not care about the outputs of what we create, and are forming decisions that have impact on people's lives based on information that is completely contrary to what comes out of academia. It's not a new problem. It's one that people have been watching happen for a while. There are many reasons for it to be happening right now, but one that deserves particular attention is the extent to which it is self-inflicted. Through our training, through our rewards, through our environments, we are on a singular track on a particular kind of output for a particular kind of audience, and that is not an audience that can put our work to use. And so we have to look at ourselves and the institutions of academia if we're going to take the first step in trying to change course and the kind of things that Heather talked about at the beginning. I did find an essay that foretold this many years ago. This is 1963, and if you have a pen and piece of paper or your camera, I encourage you to look this. It's a one-page essay in Science magazine from a researcher from the Mayo Clinic. It was called Chaos in the Brickyard. And he told an allegory. He told a story about a world where people make bricks, and the bricks are used by the master builder to build an edifice. And they are in balance. When the master builder needs a certain number of bricks, the brick makers provide them. If the master builder needs a brick of a certain size or shape, the brick makers provide it for him. But then over time, this world got a little out of whack, where the brick makers started making more and more bricks, faster and faster, more than they had a use by the master builder. And over time, he worried, would brickmaking become an end unto itself? That was in 1963. And I would start by saying in 2018, his worry is true. Brickmaking is an end unto itself. He is clearly talking about the institutions of academia. The bricks are our academic papers that stand alone as little nuggets of knowledge with no incentives to try and pull them together into their composite whole to say, what does the corpus of the research tell us? And more importantly, there are no incentives to take that corpus and apply it to the outside world, to make it accessible to those outside academia. Our reward system right now incents us to write A-level publications for smaller and smaller academic communities with no concern for its practical impact or connections to other work out there. And I think that that is dangerous, and I think we need to do something about that. And that metaphor of chaos in the brickyard is a really powerful one to start thinking about what is going on in academia and what are we doing. We do have a funny problem. When we think about the reach of our academic scholarship, you can look first and say that there are 2 million research articles published every year in about 28,000 journals. We are producing a lot of bricks. And they are growing in numbers. You can see the upward trend on that chart on the bottom. We're producing more and more. Now, who are we reaching with that work? This whole conversation can go in the direction of asking, are we actually even reaching our peers? And I'm going to give you 2 slides, but I don't want to focus on that because in some ways my job here this afternoon is to get you uncomfortable or maybe even to get you angry, because you're only going to start to change things if you see something wrong. And I'm only going to get you to sort of stir out of complacency by saying there's something fundamentally wrong. Are we reaching our peers? Oops, yeah. The average academic paper between 2000 and 2010 was cited 10.8 times. And that drops to 4.67 for the social sciences. That's our measure of impact. Let me go further. 82% of humanities articles were never cited. 32% of the social sciences never cited, 27% of the social sciences, 12% in medicine. Never cited. And you can get tenure for this work. And you might ask, what's going on here? Now, I can also go to this slide here and say, and are people outside the academy reading our work? And I don't know if can you see that chart on the right? This is a study that was done by the Pew Research Center. It came out last summer. I'm not supposed to move. It came out last summer, and I was actually asked to use that. So these blue dots are surveys of the American public. The white dots, I've lost my mouse, there it is. The white dots are surveys of AAAS scientists. The important point in this slide is the size of that blue gap. That's the difference between the two. So on the very top, is it safe to eat genetically modified foods? 88% of AAAS scientists say it is. 37% of the US public says it is. Down here, in the second tier, is climate change mostly due to human activity? 50% of the American public, 87% of AAAS scientists, a 37-point gap. And I can go through that whole list of issues up there of ways in which the American public and the scientific institutions diverge in their position on critical issues. This should concern us because the public is not listening to what we do, and yet we're producing more and more of it because our rewards tell us to, and yet it is not having an impact. We are making bricks. No one is making the edifice. No one is making for the general public, and it's our own fault. So, oops, wrong way. So I want to break my talk into two parts. One, why should academics engage in public and political discourse? Why should we change? Why should we do things differently? And then second, how should we do it? What are the rules of engagement? And I use that as just it's a convenient quip, rules of engagement, but we need to develop them. We're right at the beginning of thinking about how do we change our role as academics to become engaged scholars, to impact the world around us. In business schools, that's where I teach mostly, we talk often about innovation S-curves. We have a line, and then it starts to turn, and you have an upward slope of adoption, and then it levels off when you have saturation of a particular innovation. It could be automobiles, electric cars, cell phones, whatever. You can also talk about that kind of curve in the innovation of an idea. And the idea of a different role for academics is right at the beginning of that turn. Will it continue on the upward slope? Will we change the institutions of academia, or will it turn back down and become stillborn and not happen? In my opinion, my hope is that it will continue going up. And we need to develop a set of rules for engagement. We need to know how to do this because we don't know anything, really. We're only at the very beginning of small innovations, and I'll talk about some of those, of ways that academia is changing. So those are the two pieces, and then we'll open it up for conversation, because I also want to point out those two bullet points from my talk end with question marks. I don't have the answers. We're right at the beginning of asking these questions. And so I invite you to engage in conversation at the end of this. What are the answers? How do we approach this? What do we do about it? Okay, let's start. Why should academics engage in public and political discourse? Well, let's begin by the fact that public discourse over scientific issues is highly degraded. Heather talked about the anti-vaccine movement. This is Jenny McCarthy, who is a big spokesperson in the idea that vaccines cause autism and convincing parents not to vaccinate their children. Bobby Kennedy is also in this movement to get people not to use vaccines for fear of autism, even though the medical establishment says that connection is not there. What is going on? The fact is, most people are scientifically illiterate. This is survey data for the American public. I don't think Canadian public is that different. The national academies, the National Science Foundation, the California Academy of Sciences have done surveys of the American public and find that they fail abysmally at not only scientific knowledge, but the scientific process. What does science do? And I highlight that because we need to actually go back to basics in communicating with the public, not just what our science says, but how does it reach its conclusion? What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? What is its value? And there are many people who don't see a value in what we do. There was a survey this past fall in the United States found that 58% of conservative Republican voters think that universities have a net negative impact on society. Think about that for a second. That's the world we live in right now. And you can shake your head and say these people are ignorant, but it's our problem. And if we don't do something about it, who will? And if we cede that space, I don't think we're going to like the answer of who will, because they will come in with a particular vested interest or a particular agenda that will lead conversation in a direction that may be contrary to what science tells us. I leave that bullet point down on the bottom to really drive it home, because we have to overcome our own cynicism. 42% of Americans believe God created humans in their present form 10,000 years ago. They don't believe in evolution. One of those people is the Vice President of the United States. This is an issue that's real, and we have to address it, or no one else will. We also live in a new context. Its times are changed, and there is active distortion of science at levels unprecedented. Certainly we've had distortion of science in the past, think cigarettes and cancer, but now with certain media that are becoming available and the implications of scientific conclusions that threaten powerful economic and political interests, we live in a very, very dangerous time, a time of alternative facts and pseudoscience, of political interests, and active efforts to distort public discourse. This document on the left, anyone know what that is? Okay, this is a book. It's called Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. It's produced by the Heartland Institute, which is the #1 climate skeptics group in the country, in the world. It's a libertarian think tank that thinks that climate change is a hoax. They have produced it under the moniker of something called the NIPCC, which is a very cynical way of saying it has some kind of gravitas. The IPCC, as you know, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is the non-intergovernmental panel on climate change. And it lays out science on why we're not sure that human-induced climate change is happening. This book was printed in 125,000 copies and sent to K-12 science teachers all across the country in an attempt to influence the pedagogy of K-12 science education. This is what's at play. There's active efforts to do the exact opposite of what we do in the academy. I also add, just for your amusement, the pseudoscientific journals. I don't know about you, but I get a lot of invitations to be editor-in-chief of medical journals, engineering journals. I have no expertise in this, but we have a lot of journals popping up that if you just pay a price, you can publish your paper. And if you want to look it up, that paper in the middle is actually titled, "Get Me Off Your Fucking Mailing List." And it was published. And it nearly says the same thing over and over again. Get me off your fucking mailing list. Over and over again. They even put a chart in there with arrows. Get me off your fucking mailing list. And he published it to show what is happening. That's obviously pseudoscience. A lot of it is not obviously pseudoscience. Talk to any medical doctor right now about what it's like to talk to a patient. Here's my assessment of your condition. Here's my recommended treatment plan. And the response is, well, I actually went on WebMD and I have a different approach on how to deal with this. It happens a lot. Ask any person who chooses not to vaccinate their children, ask any person who thinks that climate change is a hoax, and they will back it up with scientific papers that confirm their position. This is the world we're entering, and we need to do something about it. Social media is a big driver of this. Why is it happening so quickly right now? And that's the presence of social media. I like to think that social media is a technology that is fundamentally changing our culture in the exact same way that the printing press changed culture in the 1500s. Prior to the printing press, the only people who had access to the Bible were priests. Then Gutenberg printed the Bible as his first book. He actually printed it in German. People could now access the Bible by themselves. They didn't need priests to do it. And then, in fact, Martin Luther used the printing press to great effect, producing a lot of pamphlets to say, here's what the Bible says, and it happens to be quite different than what the Vatican is telling you. And what was the response from the Catholic Church? Labeling them heretics, trying to shut them down, and trying to push back the tide of what this technology opened up. Well, welcome to 2018, and that technology is social media, and the Catholic Church is us. People now can get any variant of quote-unquote scientific information without any access through scientific institutions. Social media is a technology that is a fundamental shift in our reality and the public's access to information. What is our response? Rather than calling them heretics, we call them stupid. We produce contrary positions. We publish them in our academic journals. I mean, if I see one more academic saying, yes, we need to engage more in public and political discourse, I'm going to write another academic paper on it and publish it in my academic journal so I can get tenure. I'm going to scream, because that's not the answer. And we need to get out there and get engaged, or we will end up just as the Catholic Church did. They are now one of many authorities on the Bible, but they weren't kicking and screaming. And I think we can embrace the change that's going on and start to focus on it. And social media is doing that. Certainly in teaching, we have MOOCs and online education. We have different kinds of outlets available to us. The Conversation, how many people are familiar with The Conversation? Okay. If you're not, look it up. This is a platform available to academics to write essays based on their research on a Creative Commons license that can be picked up by anyone for free. I've published in here and found my essays show up in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal. This is called impact in a real way. The Monkey Cage in the Washington Post is another one. Then certainly Twitter and Facebook are relevant. I see a lot of academics who say, I'm not going to touch it. It's not important. And we actually have a president in Washington, D.C. right now who has shown us quite clearly that Twitter does matter. Whether you like it or not, it does matter. And there are efforts to try and rein it in and try and make sense out of it. If you haven't heard of Altmetric, Impact Story, look them up. There's some serious money behind them. Impact Story has money from the National Science Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. Altmetric is funded by a number of publishers, all designed around creating metrics of impact beyond the academy to sit alongside citation counts or H-index. We all live by numbers. What are the numbers going to be in the future for measuring our impact beyond the academy? It is changing what we do. It is also changing public discourse, and we have to recognize this. This is a study, I love this study. This was done at the University of Indiana, and they were looking at Twitter, and they got their hands on 500,000 tweets before the midterm elections. And they had an algorithm that coded them liberal or conservative, and then looked at who's retweeting who. And it's not hard to figure out the conclusion of their paper by looking at the very clear fact that there's a conservative conversation and a liberal conversation going on there. People are not talking to each other. Now, we need to recognize this because we are in that blue sphere. Academia is a liberal institution. A lot of my colleagues get angry when I say that, but surveys show it to be true. Liberals outnumber conservatives 3-to-1 in law schools, and that's the closest ratio across the campus, all the way down to 18-to-1 in history departments. We have a bias within, and we are dropping into that landscape on a particular side of it, and we can correct. We can course correct because we have to, because the quality of the discourse is changing. This is another study by the Pew Research Center. It came out this past June. And it shows the widening divide in the United States. And this is not unique to the United States. Populism is across the world. And so on the left, you can see the bell curve for Republicans and Democrats, and the median very close together. 2004, still very close together. 2014, 17, a wide gap between liberals and conservatives, between Republicans and Democrats. We are cleaving, and social media has a big influence on that happening. So I would start with there just simply saying, what a rich area for research. How in the world did that happen? The recent study that just came out that just went viral showing that negative news travels much faster than positive news. That's just the tip of the iceberg of how we can understand how social media works, because we don't. And we don't know how it changes our world. How many people understand how a paper shows up in Google Scholar? Anyone? How many people think that Google Scholar is important for people to access your work? Does that disconnect alarm you at all? If the impact of your work relies on Google Scholar, yet you have no idea how something shows up in Google Scholar, that should. And you need to learn about DOI numbers. You need to learn about ORCID accounts. You need to know how this whole world works, where people access information. In my day, when I did my dissertation, I went up to the stacks to get a paper. I pulled a book off the shelf. I thumbed through. I Xeroxed by hand, 1 page at a time, that paper. I went to the bibliography. I found another paper. I went back up. And I would spend days, weeks, months doing this. And now people go to Google Scholar and they pull the papers up really fast. How did those papers show up on that queue? It's not random. There is an algorithm behind it. And we all would do well to understand how those algorithms work. Social media, it changes what we do. And there is public antagonism towards what we do. In the United States, we have states that are cutting funding for higher education. Just go to Wisconsin and North Carolina. They're the epicenters of this. Florida is trying to cut funding. And there is a general antagonism. We are seen as elites. And our work is seen as elitist. National Geographic had a cover story, The War on Science. People resenting what we do. They don't trust us. This is not new. The book that won the Pulitzer Prize in 1964 was called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, written by Hofstadter. And he pointed out that there's a great many people in our society that see scientists with suspicion. They live in an ivory tower. They talk about things I don't understand. They use a language I can't comprehend, and they have a disproportionate influence on the political process. I don't trust them. And they happen to lean left. I don't trust them even more. And they're charging my kid too much tuition. And there seem to be some kinks in the armor. You have this dilemma in psychology right now about the reproducibility crisis. This should all start to sound familiar, going back to my metaphor of the Reformation. What was Martin Luther's issue was indulgences, which was a legitimate criticism of the Catholic Church. We do have some kinks in the armor, and we're ignoring them, and we need to address them because people will seize on them and say, yeah, see, that little kink over there, the whole institution has to come down. And the more we hide that kink, the more they think the institution has to come down. So we need to face that. Oops, I keep getting the arrows wrong. My hope, though, is that there is a generational split happening right now. Right now, in surveys, many academics, established academics, don't see it as their job to inform the public. Surveys show this to be true. I merely write my research, and then whatever happens to it, I don't have any role in that, and I think that's a dangerous and a rapidly outdated mode. We did a survey of faculty at the University of Michigan, found that 56% believe public engagement is not valued by tenure committees, 41% believe it's time-consuming and distracting, 34% believe it's dangerous and is often misquoted. Balance that against surveys showing that young academics coming into our field want to have impact in the real world. And so there is a difference between what our young people coming in want to do with their career and what the old people are thinking about as they sunset in their career. And if you want to fall back on the old adage, and help me find the source of this, but there's a famous quote, science advances one death at a time. And so our world is changing, and it will change. On the role of social media, again, looking at University of Michigan faculty, 39% do not and never will use Twitter for academic and professional work. 35% say the same for Facebook. Yet young people see it as relevant and important. Now, the funny thing is, I can show you data. There is research starting to emerge. This is such a ripe area for more research. There is research shows that the more an academic paper is tweeted, the more it's cited. We don't have really good studies on the internal mechanics of how that happened. This is a whole ripe area for study that is totally self-interested. What is going on here? How does this work? So I turn to the young people. This is your world, and you can make it what you wish. And so, how is this happening? But it is happening. There are academics who are doing this. They are engaging in public and political discourse in a number of ways. And there are efforts to try and figure it out more. The National Academies has hosted 3 Sackler colloquia on the science of science communication. I'm on the committee for the 4th one. The focus is going to be storytelling. How do we teach academics how to be storytellers? If you want to communicate with the public, storytelling works. The Sloan Foundation has kicked in a lot of money on the public understanding of science, technology, and economics. And there are a growing number of centers and resources for engagement, teaching people how to do this. Elena and I have both been through the Leopold Leadership Fellowship that really taught us how to speak to government, how to speak to journalists, how to compose a blog, how to make your research into a compact statement that people can grasp. Alan Alda has kicked in a lot of money at Stony Brook. There's a center at Northwestern. There's a center at UMass. Is there an opportunity for a center at McGill on how to engage in public and political discourse, how to teach it to others? At University of Michigan, we had something funny happen. There's a group of doctoral students and postdocs that got together and said, you know what? If you're not going to teach us how to do this, we're going to teach ourselves. They created a group called Relate, and they are setting up seminars and training camps and workshops on how to talk to journalists, how to talk to government, how to develop a social media presence, how to do all this. And the funny thing was, they did it all without telling their advisors because they are afraid their advisors would punish them for doing this. This is not what you're supposed to be doing. As a doctoral student, you're supposed to be focusing on research. I'm on a committee for the president of the University of Michigan, and he wants to make this a big issue. He wants to focus on this, really change the culture at the University of Michigan. And so he did where you would obviously start, well, we should have a dinner to celebrate those that are doing it. And we found something very funny. The senior professors who are doing it didn't want to come. They didn't want to out themselves for doing this because they didn't want their peers to look at them and say that, well, they're less serious academics because they're doing that slightly non-academic stuff of engaging in public and political discourse. That is part of what we're facing, and we need to do something about it. How urgent is the change before us? I'm going to offer you two views to consider it. And the first is a rather hopeful and optimistic and aspirational view. It lays on the notion that Jane Lubchenco, who used to be the head of NOAA, used to be head of the AAAS, she started the Leopold Leadership Fellowship Program. She's an accomplished academic, quite amazing woman. And when she was president of the AAAS, she wrote an essay called Science's Social Contract, with the idea that we as academics have an obligation to serve society with our work, to provide work that is of use to society, to politics, to the development of regulation, to the guidance of business, to the structure of our institutions. And we're not meeting that obligation. She wrote it in 1998, and she followed up in 2015 because not a whole lot had changed. In 2015, I did a conference at the University of Michigan on this topic, and here's the report that came out of it, and I'm going to leave this with Heather. And I like to point out that the opening panel of that conference, and it did not take any arm twisting, I was able to get 4 university presidents to show up to be on that panel: Virginia, Dartmouth, Arizona State, and Michigan. Michigan was easy, I just had to walk across campus. But Terry Sullivan came up from Virginia on a jet. The jet waited for her. She did the panel, she got back on the jet, and she flew home. It was that important to her. And there they are, sitting there, engaging, discussing this topic. And this quote from Mark Schlissel, and I unwisely left my reading glasses over there, so I'm going to give it a shot anyway. We forget the privilege it is to have lifelong security of employment at a spectacular university, and it is a privilege. We live a privileged life. I'm on sabbatical right now. Try and explain the sabbatical to people who are not in academia, and you'll get a good sense of what a privileged life we have. And I don't think we use it for its intended purpose. I think the faculty, on average, through the generations, are becoming a bit careerists and staying inside our comfort zones. But if we're perceived as being an ivory tower and talking to one another and being proud of our discoveries and our awards and our accomplishments and the letters after our name, I think in the long run, the enterprise is going to suffer in this society's eyes, and our potential for impact will diminish. The willingness of society to support us will decrease. So there's an aspirational charge. We need to do something about this because this is who we are, and we've kind of lost our way. There's a darker way of looking at it. The Economist actually wrote an article in 2010 asking whether American higher ed, but I always think of American, Canadian as all part of the same institutions, are we going the way of the big three? The big three dominated the auto sector. There were threats from the outside, particularly Japanese competition in smaller cars. They ignored it, and they lost market share. They lost significant market share. Are we facing the same kind of threat? Certainly universities are popping up all around the world, but also other sources of knowledge are popping up as well. And are we going to be displaced? We're not certainly going to go away, but is this going to drive increasing irrelevance to what we do? And this is where Michael Crow, who is quite agitated and quite passionate about this topic, that there is a crisis in higher education, is becoming a privileged opportunity for the elite, and that the further that goes, the more dangerous it is for society. And he said this: "We are increasingly filled with hubris, filled with arrogance, cut off from the general public, and unable to find an appropriate tone with which to communicate. We need to communicate in ways that we have never even thought about communicating before, because if we don't figure out how to deal with this, the gap between the academic elite and everyone else will continue to grow. And what we now see as political debate will be people with pitchforks outside the door." And I had to put ... because I did it 3 times in a row. He's like, pitchforks, pitchforks. The other 3 presidents were backing up. Where's this guy? He was frothing at the mouth. He's quite upset about this. And he says they want to know what we're doing, why we exist, and why they're giving us money. This is a very serious thing we need to focus on. I lean more towards Michael Crow's sense of the urgency of the issue. I lean more towards Mark Schlissel's aspirational statement of how to get there. Because I think in many ways it is just returning to who we are, returning more to a service model, moving away from being brickmakers and trying to create knowledge that has more impact and more connection to real-world issues. So, what are the rules of engagement? How can we do this? And this is where I invite your feedback. I invite your contributions. I hope I will start a conversation here that will keep on going. I hope I will start a fire. And I hope I will do that by creating some energy and some possibilities for what can be. Here are some questions we don't know the answers to in terms of public engagement, and I just want to walk through each one of them. What is public engagement? Well, for example, what is the role of the academic in the public and political sphere? We don't know what that is. Many academics think, well, my research says X, the data says X, and I always laugh. I say, well, last time I heard, data didn't speak. It was communicated in a certain way through a certain medium, received by a certain audience in a certain way. And how should we expect that to work? Roger Pielke wrote a very provocative book, I don't know if any of you have seen it, called The Honest Broker, where he introduced this topic and really ignited a fire. A lot of people were very upset over this book, but it is a good provocation. What is our role? And he laid out 4 different roles. And one of them is the pure scientist. And he says that, that's a fiction. I sit in my lab, I do research with no concern for the world around me. The other is an issue broker. I'm blanking for a second. This is someone who people go to and say, give us an answer or something. The National Academies does this. They don't stimulate or precipitate their own research. Congress comes to and says, give us an answer on X. The 2 remaining categories are the important one. One is called issue advocate, and the other called the honest broker. He said he wasn't making a pejorative statement on those 2, but he did choose the word honest broker. Now, an issue advocate, in his mind, takes all the science, narrows it down, and says to the public, this is what you need to know. Don't worry about that other stuff. The honest broker takes it all, puts it in the public sphere, and says, it's yours. Work it out. One narrows the range of possibilities, one opens it up. Which should we do? There are dangers for the issue advocate. Because once the public smells, well, wait a minute, you didn't show us that conclusion over there. What are you hiding? It does open up a very, very wide target for attack, and we should be careful there. By the same token, can we expect the public to consume the massive knowledge on a topic like climate change? That's a tall order. So how do we play this role? What role do we play? He really got a lot of people upset because by that definition, there are a lot of scientists who are issue advocates. An advocate is a dangerous word for an academic because that sort of crosses the line between knowledge creators and policy advocates, and we have to be careful there. So, what is our role? We have to give that some thought. Second, where is the line between what I call legitimate and illegitimate public discourse, public engagement? I try and think of it like a supply chain. You have really basic research up here, and then it moves closer and closer, and then there's a line. And now you start to get into the political sphere. And I think as academics, we have to be careful not to cross that line. It's a very gray line. It's a very fuzzy line. It's not always clear where it is. But we have to be careful because once you're seen as biased, as subjective, as having a particular position on something that has political import, it starts to compromise your objectivity as an academic. And I use those words with some chagrin because the idea of pure objectivity is not available to us as human beings. We are all subjective to a certain degree, but where is that line? So for example, I have a colleague, very, very accomplished colleague on climate science who went on the Bill Maher show. And I was like, really? I think of this as shock infotainment. Is this really? And he's like, Andy, if Rush Limbaugh invites me, I'm going there too. I'm going where the people are. It's a question. Should you be on the Bill Maher show? Should you on the Howard Stern show? Where's the line? What is legitimate and illegitimate? What do we mean by public engagement? What are the platforms? How do we do it? Third question, when should an academic engage? This is a tricky one. So for example, young people, doctoral students in the room, I could say to you, do not do this. Do not write editorials. Do not write blogs. Be very, very careful because your job is to get your dissertation done and then spend the next 7 years getting tenure. And then when you get tenure, now you can start to do it. But that's not going to work because the idea that you're going to put all your passions for engaging in real-world issues on the side for 5 plus 7, maybe a total of 12, 13 years, and at the end of that, you're just going to flick a switch and you suddenly become this engaged scholar. It isn't going to happen because over those 13 years, that fire will have been extinguished. At the same time, we live in an apprentice model. You have to get your A-level publications out there to get tenure. That is the world you live in. So how do we teach people how to meter it in slowly? Keep your toe in the water, develop it carefully, don't overdo it, keep the fire alive, and then start to really ignite and go forward. And then even further than that, how do we change those who become full professors who keep on doing what they were doing as assistant professors? Keep making bricks. In this conference, it was a very provocative proposal that I liked. What if, once someone became full professor, their first obligation was to write a corpus? You've just spent 20 years developing this body of literature. Tell us what it says in its entirety and write it for a lay audience. That would scare the living daylights out of many, many full professors. Yet what an experience, what a challenge, what a task that would be to try and pull it all together, build that edifice out of all those bricks you've made, and make it useful to society. What an experience that would be. And then fourth, who should engage in public and political discourse? This is something a lot of my colleagues push back on. They come back and say, Andy, I don't want to do this. I have someone come back and say, I can't do this. And I will agree with them, no, you shouldn't do this. You're not very good at that. Not everyone should do this. What this has to argue for is a widening the tent of the possible roles that an academic can play, rather than this one narrow role that we have defined through the tenure and review process. How do we widen the possibilities, the tracks that academics can play? Don't know. Second question, how should we engage? Well, this is, again, not fitting with what we were taught as academics. We have to move beyond the knowledge deficit model. The knowledge deficit model says I go up to a person in the general public, Mr. John Q. Public, and I approach him as having a brain half full. And I will pour my knowledge into his brain, and he will start to think like I do, and he will start to make the right decisions. And this is the mode that many academics engage in public and political discourse. I could tell you in Ann Arbor, and I suspect it's true in Montreal as well, there are a lot of people in Ann Arbor not connected to the university who are very hesitant to invite academics to a dinner party because they're so afraid they're going to get the lecture. They're going to get talked at. They're going to get talked down to because that's what we do. Because I am a knowledge expert and you are my minion and I will now share my knowledge with you. It's called a monologue and people don't like it. Engagement is a dialogue. Engagement is back and forth. Engagement is about conversing and listening, which is something that we're not always good at. Number two is you need to know your audience. I can't just parachute into a farming community in Michigan and start talking to the local farmers about climate change. They're not going to listen to me. We have Detroit just to the east of us, and a lot of people in Detroit resent Michigan scholars coming in because see you people coming from the suburbs, you're going to tell us what's wrong with us, you're going to give us the answer, and you're going to walk out again. And you have no commitment, you have no place in the community. And if you really want to get engaged, you need to develop some relationships. It takes some time, it takes some effort. The third, master social media before it masters us. I got this phraseology in this report, we had two people who were very expert in their particular areas in very controversial topics. One on misogyny in the gaming industry. Can I get any more incendiary than that? And the other was the Middle East crisis, minor in comparison. And both of them said the same thing independently. They said, you can choose not to have a social media presence. You can stay off Twitter and Facebook and don't do blogs and thump your chest if it's some kind of virtue. But if you are in a politically contested area, you will get pulled in and a social media presence will be created for you. And if you don't create it, trust me, you are not going to like the one they create for you. And so you need to get ahead. And so teaching people how to do this, how to have a platform, and how to do it carefully. It does have costs, and you have to be very careful. We are, as one of my colleagues said, one of the most easily Googleable people on earth. You know, you can just look up Andy Hoffman, University of Michigan, and you can find all you want. That is an important domain to recognize how it can play out. I had a personal example. I wrote a paper to start my work on culture and climate change. And it was in organizational dynamics. And I made an analogy. I'm going to have to do this very quickly, but I made an analogy to the abolition of slavery. That when people said abolish slavery, people said we can't do that. The entire economy is based on it. And there are parallels now to saying we have to abolish fossil fuels. I'm sorry, that was very cursory. The point I want to make is climate skeptics seized on that and really started to attack me. I have a folder for hate mail because of that. I was asked 2 years ago by the office of George Shultz, former Secretary of State. That got my attention. They're forming a panel of all the CEOs of the natural gas companies to do voluntary reductions on fugitive emissions of natural gas facilities. And if you don't know, natural gas is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. If you have fugitive emissions anywhere from 4 to 7% of flow-through from a natural gas pipeline or distribution network, natural gas is actually worse on climate change than coal. So the fact that they were coming together to talk about voluntary reductions in a very secret way, and they asked me, would you moderate the discussion? I tripped. I was like, absolutely, I would love to. A week before, one of the CEOs looked me up, found the brouhaha over the slavery abolition thing and said, I don't want Hoffman in the room. And I was out, just like that. My social media presence. Now, would I have done anything differently? No. Would I have liked to have known that could happen? Yes. How do we teach others that there are implications for how to do this? I know a doctoral student who published an essay and editorial in the New York Times saying that planting trees does not reduce the impact of climate change because she had some research that said this. And she was offered the opportunity. How do you turn it down? Well, that flies in the face of all the science that's out there. If you look this person up, you'll find senior scientist after senior scientist taking her apart. And when she comes up for tenure, let's hope none of those people are on her committee or writing letters for her. So understanding a few steps forward, because we're in the Wild West right now on how to do this. So we need to master social media. And then an important thing that's very hard to do, stay within your area of expertise. I do get frustrated when I hear climate scientists having these very expert opinions on carbon taxes and environmental economists talking about the intricacies of climate science. It's tricky territory, and there's a desire to do that. Be very, very careful. Number 3, what are the obstacles that need to be overcome? Formal rewards and tenure and the informal culture. It's that simple. So how are the rewards of tenure set up? We put together a packet of A-level publications. We put it out for letters of people who know how to write A-level publications, and we're evaluated for our A-level publications. It's that simple. How do we change that? How do we find different kinds of letter writers? How do we add different metrics? This is where alt-metric or impact story could come in. I can tell you that the Mayo Clinic has added social media to its tenure and review process. This is an experiment. At the Ross School where I teach, we all get evaluated on research, teaching, and service. We've added a 4th criteria called practice. We still don't quite measure it, but we are adding a 4th criteria because prior to that, it's sat in service. And as you all know, what is the most demoted of those 3? It's service. And if you put it in with that, it's not going to register. So it had to get its own category. And it's interesting also, every school has to define it for themselves. What is practice? What is impact? And then we have the informal culture. There's a problem within academia. It's called the Carl Sagan syndrome, that if you're seen as engaging in public and political discourse, you're a hack, you're a popularizer. Carl Sagan, probably one of the most influential scientists of his time, got denied tenure and denied admission to the national academies because he was seen as a lightweight. When I was a doctoral student at MIT, Lester Thoreau became the dean of the Sloan School of Management, a very well-respected economist, and he started to write some trade books. And so the economics professors started calling him less thorough and started to mock him for doing this. He died last year. His obituary in the New York Times brought up less thorough. It stuck. That is the Carl Sagan syndrome, that if you're doing this, you must not be that serious an academic, and we need to change that, and that's not going to change easily. What are some structural tools for supporting engagement? Some schools are employing science translators. You write a paper, they'll come to your office, they'll try and find a way to write something that will take your work out there. I think this is a good first step, but I think we should take that responsibility on ourselves. It is not that hard to write a 600 or 700 word essay that sums up a paper if you really are passionate and understand the work that's there. And I would add that the outlets, like what I described the conversation, you will pitch them your essay, they will assign you an editor who will start to edit it for you for free. And then out it goes. And so some schools can hire science translators. That can be a first step. Certainly having media people that can help you place something inside higher education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. There are people out there that are standing by ready to help you do that, and they are frustrated because not enough academics take them up on that offer. We have to change the training, both formal and informal, starting from the doctoral student level all the way up through senior professor, and we're not doing that. I don't know about your doctoral education. I wasn't even taught how to teach. It was research all the way. And so if we're not teaching people how to teach, we're certainly not teaching them how to engage with the general public, and we need to change that. And then recognizing the limits of academic inquiry in the public sphere. You're not always going to win. You will get misquoted. No journalist is going to quote your entire abstract verbatim in their article. It's not going to happen. Accept that. And that leads to the fifth and final point, what to expect from engagement. First of all, it is messy. It is not as precise as the study you did in the lab. It can be hostile. It stings. The first time I got hate mail, it really stung. It really is a tough pill to swallow. And I have a lot of colleagues who can't understand this. They say, my work isn't political. And I just laugh, because if you're saying anything of importance, if you're challenging how people think, what they believe, or how they behave, you are by definition political. And you should embrace that. What's the worst thing you could do, could happen to you if you put your work out there in the public sphere? People ignore it. It's a big yawn. There's an adage, if you're not offending anyone, you never took a stand. If you do get blowback, it means you said something important. It comes with it. That's the way it goes. There's actually a quote from Paul Newman. It says, if you don't have enemies, you don't have character. I would actually flop that. There are people with enemies that deserve them, but if you have character, if you have integrity in your work, you will have enemies, because it is saying something important. You're challenging how people think. It can also be highly rewarding. I find it extremely gratifying to give talks to business conferences or environmental NGOs who come up to me and say, I never thought about it that way before. It is extremely gratifying, and it can prove your research, because through those engagements, my research questions become better, because they're connected more to what's going on out there in the real world. And I find that very, very satisfying. Engagement should also change your publication strategy. Right now, you write a paper, presumably you send it to an A journal, because that's what gets you tenure or status. How long does it take to come out? Anywhere between 10 months and 4 or 5 years. The longer that time goes, that's called guaranteed irrelevance, and your work will not have impact. What if you change the way you approached it? I have this paper. This really needs to come out faster. I'm going to send it to a B journal, a terminology I don't like, because it will come out faster. I've had desk accepts at B journals, and it comes out really fast. And then the paper comes out. Do I just put a line on my resume and move on, or do I write that blog and then do an interview on the radio and then give some public talks on it? That is new steps in the research process, but really gratifying ones. And it doesn't lead you down to oblivion. Paul Krugman, who won a Nobel Prize, the work that got him the Nobel Prize was in B journals. I had the opportunity to ask him, why'd you send it to B journals? His answer was, because the A's wouldn't take it. And a lot of people have looked at the A's as very narrowing and constraining on what is considered legitimate research, because they have their particular tracks, and anything that's creative or steps outside that will not get published there. How does that bias us? And then as social media platforms start to emerge and expand, we should be thinking more about a broader palette, a broader portfolio of places to get our work out in different forms, reaching different audiences with different tones. And right now we're very monolithic, and we need to start to change that. So I think I've talked enough and screwed up the arrows here plenty. I want to end there. And it sounds a little truncated and stopped because I want it to feel that way, because I have no period to put on this sentence. I have no answers for you, other than to say that there's a change afoot, and we need to sort of understand what this means for how we practice our craft and what we do. What is the future role of the engaged scholar? What is the future role of the scholar, period? I want to ask you that question. So there's a mic here. If you have any reactions, if you want to throw tomatoes, that's fine too. But I hope you stirred you. I hope you are, if you care about your profession, and I find this a funny irony that as you become senior in your career, there's no incentive for you to care about the institutions of your profession, because you will still get rewarded for producing those bricks. And I think more of us as senior professors need to start to recognize the peril that our institutions are facing, take responsibility for trying to change them, if nothing else, for the benefit of the generation of the scholars that follow us. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
You've thrown us out quite a challenge. I think I don't come into the generation that has to change, though. I would ask you to speak into the microphone if you can, so that we can pick it up, because it's being recorded. And please start that conversation. You've been given a major challenge.
And if you could just tell me your name and where you come from, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, Theo.
I have to stand up. Theo van der Ven, Professor of Chemistry. I find your talk very interesting, but it's, to me, a bit academic. You don't give any examples. Are there role models out we should look at, we can follow? In Canada, we have a famous professor, infamous depending on who you talk to, which is Jordan Peterson. Okay. Who is, he is everywhere in the social media. His book is the bestseller on Amazon.com. Is that an example we should follow? Is that an example to stay away from?
To begin, I think that everyone has to define it for themselves. There's no one model. Otherwise, that's contrary to what I just said of expanding the tent of possible roles, and the kind of persona you want to have has to emerge. I get pushback from colleagues saying, Andy, what do you want us to do? Write the next version of Who Moved My Cheese? I'm like, well, there's a big difference between Who Moved My Cheese and someone I admire, Jonathan Haidt, who's a psychologist at NYU. And he writes some really great work, The Happiness Hypothesis, the Righteous Mind, that really are solid psychology work that tell us something about how the world works around us. So there are models. But I also find a funny irony, and that is that if you really want to look at the great intellectuals of society, I have to go much further back than that. I think the great intellectuals of our society were in the mid-1900s. You know, Sinclair Lewis, Lewis Mumford, even Rachel Carson. She wasn't connected to a university, wrote Silent Spring, a very influential book. I think that's where the careerism of academia starts to get in the way of people looking for that one mode. So I don't know this professor you're talking about. That's one model. It may be, you know, Neil deGrasse Tyson has a PhD, and now he's doing TV, Cosmos. Maybe that's another. I know a law professor at Penn who does work on fraud, corporate fraud, and is like, you know what, I'm tenured and I'm writing all these papers and it makes no change in the real world around fraud. So what'd she do? She actually went out for real funding to produce a first-class documentary on corporate fraud. Her dean thinks she's nuts. She doesn't care. Everyone has to find their own way, because I also think that we don't know. Again, I really feel like we're at the edge of a frontier. It's the Wild West. And so I think there are models out there that we haven't even thought of that can start to work. And just because this one professor did it one way, there are other ways to do it as well. And so I would just offer that.
We don't have two microphones, do
Hi, Nate Kitoriano, Materials Engineering. Two points. One is if people pay the price of something's value, and effectively, tuition in the States is skyrocketing, then there's still value in it, and I don't think at least that part is under threat. But I do agree that engaging in the larger world is important. And on one part of that aspect, I want to ask you about the asymmetry of that engagement. So you asked us to stay in our core realm of knowledge, whereas those who are on the opposite side are not in their core realm of knowledge. I'd like to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, the world is unfair. I mean, we'd all love to be Noam Chomsky. We'd all love to be a professor of linguistics who becomes globally famous for talking about global politics. That is not a route that's available to all of us. Yes, some people play unfair. They play fast and loose with data, with methods, but we have to stick true to who we are. This is a very interesting question because it is not a new one, actually. It goes all the way back to World War II. If you want to look at some of the early documents, look up a report by Vannevar Bush. World War II is a turning point for science because, we had just won the World War and science helped us do it. Radar, the atomic bomb, sonar, and the administration of the United States says, how do we turn this towards public good? And that's when the National Science Foundation was formed. That's where government funding of research was formed or began. To a lot of people, that was the beginning of the end of the true objectivity of the academic enterprise. It's a controversial topic that has a long history to it. And so I think the worst thing were us to just sort of take off all the rules and the boundaries around which scientific inquiry takes place and just become pundits and editorialists. I mean, Paul Krugman and Jeffrey Sachs are pundits. They would actually admit that. They also have Nobel Prizes. That gives them a certain latitude to do that. But if we start to become pundits, that we lose the power of the academy. And that's where I talk about that line. And so there may be people on the other side of the line who don't have any respect for boundaries and feel they can talk as experts on anything. I think we still need to recognize that we don't have that luxury, but there are other people on the other side of the boundary that do, and you can take your work and you can hand it off over that line. The Union of Concerned Scientists, any one of a number of think tanks, NGOs, and others will take that work and run with it and let that messiness start to play out. But recognizing that there is a bound that you as a professor have to stay within. And that's just the constraint of the scientific enterprise. And I think that's a source of strength. Anyone who talks to a journalist should be very careful. If you're not given media training, you should. A journalist calls you up. What's the worst thing you can do? You can take the call. What should you do? Say, can I call you back in 10 minutes? What do you do in that 10 minutes? You look the journalist up. You figure out what's their angle, where are they coming from. You understand what questions they're going to ask you, and you figure out what you want to tell them. And the worst thing you can do is start to get really passionate, exciting, and off you go. And anyone who's done this has had it happen to them. You're just going, it's hearing silence on the other end, and all you say something, and you hear this typing, and they say, thank you very much, I got what I need. And you're like, oh no, what did I just say? Because you just got a little too loose, and you should be very careful. And something can come out, and you wish it didn't. I was quoted above the fold in the New York Times when Barack Obama finally spoke about climate change at Georgetown, and the quote was just flippant. I said, well, that's great. He finally developed a backbone. Above the fold. Thank you very much. Very loose, very unwise. I didn't get any blowback for it, but I was quite embarrassed. And so if I was starting to render opinions on something of which I don't have expertise, I should be fully prepared to have someone put a bullet right between, not literally, but really, I created a big bullseye on my chest for someone to go at me. If I really didn't know what I was talking about, that's very, very dangerous. And it's very easy to do that in the heat of the moment. It would be very easy to do that right now, of presenting something as a fact when it's not. We all get excited, we're human beings, but just be very, very careful. And so that's where I'd say keep the binders on there. So with a journalist, it's perfectly appropriate to say, that's really outside my area of expertise. May I recommend you talk to my colleague so-and-so? And that would be a wise move, rather than just rendering an opinion on something that you don't know something about. Because again, part of that informal culture is that you're seen as a media, fill in the blank. You know, you just crave media attention. And that can kill you just as well as the Carl Sagan syndrome. And you don't want to be seen as that, if someone will talk to anyone about anything. I do know people that will do that. I think it's an unwise tack to take. Okay?
1, 2, 3.
Hi, my name is Kemi, and I'm a PhD student, well, finishing PhD student. Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I feel like, as a upcoming academic person, to me, there's a feedback loop that you haven't addressed. Is the idea that, like, in the hiring community right now, there's a lot of people that tend to hire people that have a lot of publication. But if you go outside and you want to do this public engagement, it takes away time from your publication. And I'm a bit worried because if we there are a lot of scientists that go out there are publishing all this paper, and these are the people who are going to get hired. And so there's kind of like, how are we going to be seeing a change in the academic world, in the professorship that we have? I was just curious if you had any idea if there was a way to maybe deal with this, or if we're doomed in this path to research.
I mean, I would begin by saying I'm presenting to you the world as it is going, but the world is as it is. We are an apprentice model. So you have to do your academic publications. You have to. I would also add, though, this may not sit well, but if you're doing the work you care about and reaching the audiences you want to reach, and you get denied tenure, maybe you shouldn't be an academic, and maybe you'd be happier in a nonprofit, in a think tank, in a community. You know, maybe the work you are meant to do is not to be done within academia. And I don't mean that as any kind of slight whatsoever. I would hope that would be liberating. You know, when I came up for tenure, I can honestly say I was completely ambivalent on whether I got it, because I knew what I was doing. I could get a job in the nonprofit corporate sector pretty quickly. I've seen professors come up for tenure, and they've been laser focused on that outcome, and they become basket cases because they have no options, and this is what they want to be, and they're worried about whether they fit. And if you don't fit in academia, then you probably fit someplace else better. But I bring this up also as a way of saying that the world is changing. And so I actually don't think that there's something you said that I don't agree with, that it's either or. If you're doing engagement, you must not be doing the research, because it's we are human beings, we have 24 hours in a day, but you don't spend 24 hours doing your research. You have other aspects of who you are as an individual and what you do with your life. And I do think it is possible to do both. And that is one of the, I think, the barriers for people, for example, getting involved in social media. Andy, I have so much time. I don't have time to do this. I'm like, for God's sakes, a tweet does not take a heck of a lot of time. And there are tools, Hootsuite, that can help you do it easily. And again, that blog, that essay based on your research, 500-700 words, it's not that hard. When you're talking about a 2-year period to write a paper, and you can, I don't think I'm unique in being able to say, I can punch that blog out in a couple of hours. I can. And Elaine is nodding her head. You can. It's not that hard. And the more you do it, the easier it's going to become, because it becomes part of your portfolio. And if we teach you how to do it, it's going to be even easier still. And so I think that you can be a much more multifaceted academic going forward, but I really want to state this clearly. The rules are what they are. I can't change them overnight, and no one can. In fact, it was fascinating. In that panel of 4 university presidents, the questions from the audience kept going toward them. You're the president, fix it. Over and over again. They're just getting hammered. And then we left, and we had to go get pictures taken. It was me, the 4 presidents, and the photographer. No one else in the room. The moment that door closed, you should have heard the conversation. Who do those people think we are? I'm the president. I do not have a magic wand. You want to corral faculty? Good luck. because I can only cajole and nudge, but I cannot dictate. And so it's really up to you of what kind of an academic you want to be, but recognizing that the structure is what it is. See the world for what it is. Do what you need to be what you want to be, but don't totally become something you don't want to be in order to fit in. Does that help?
Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions, which are from the front here, and I'm sorry for everybody else. So I'm going to ask that we'll have 2 short questions here, and then we'll take everything outside because there is a cocktail, which you must finish before 5 o'clock. So you had a question, didn't you? Okay, you have a question. Okay.
Yeah, I'm an engineer, Frank Kruzik. I got a very simple phrase that I think only engineers have been told to talk about. Well, you got to know when to analyze and you got to know when to synthesize. It's so simple, but most politicians, as they get further on the scale, they're always on the wrong side of that. There's something wrong there, and I go back to when the kids, half of them don't know mathematics, they don't like math. That's what they call it, math. And they grow up with that, not liking math. That has got to change, and we got to get some people that will, be more succinct about how they analyze things. Mm-hmm. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that we have a role to play in that. How many have gone and given a talk at a local high school? I have. It's very gratifying. And it is playing the role. And it's fascinating what happens when you see these high school kids actually meet a professor. It opens their eyes to another track that's possible. And so we can play a role in fixing this. This is where I get back to my earlier point, is the idea of just simply saying that, the public doesn't understand this stuff and, I just wash my hands of them, they're morons. That's not going to help. And so how can we start to take it upon ourselves as part of our portfolio, even if it's not in the reward system? Because I shudder at people who are only driven by extrinsic rewards. I mean, we have our intrinsic motivations for doing this. And even if you don't get that gold star, do it anyway. Be the kind of professor you want to be. And if you see this as a problem, you are one person, but there are many others who feel the same way. And if someone sees you doing it, they will start to say, oh, I can do that too. I have a colleague in engineering. Said he's in the National Academy of Engineering, and he said, he was there at a meeting. There was a professor from MIT, who was in the National Academy, and he had a junior faculty member with him. I was like, who's this junior faculty member? I'm teaching him about service. I'm grooming him to be a member of the National Academies. Do they do that here at McGill? I can tell you they don't do it at Michigan. If I get into the National Academies, I pat myself on the back, and I'm all alone going off to, my own ambitions. But how do we change that? Again, to my mind, it's all getting down to the idea of service. And where can you serve? And if it's only extrinsic rewards to maximize my H index, you can get some pretty warped behavior. Like, for example, if that's the only objective, I've seen people do it. I'm sure you have too. Teaching, research, and service. I'm going to do the research. My teaching is going to be bare minimum. My service, I'm going to dump as much as I can so I can crank out that research. I don't like working with those people. They're destructive to the culture. They destroy a department. I've seen it happen. And yet the rewards lead us there. Wise department chairs, and I've seen this happen too, saying, that guy coming up for tenure, he's got great publications, but he's a flaming, and we're going to deny him tenure. And I've seen it happen, and that's encouraging too. Okay.
And final question. I'm sorry for other people. You have one? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Juliet. I'm in environmental sociology. I completely agree with you that there's probably a big communication problem, but I wonder if there are not also other very important problems that must be looked into. And the first one that I think of is the very nature of science, of being fundamentally evolutionary and also not monolithic in space. And this might be at odds with people's needs or wishes in their daily lives. And for example, with health, people are more interested in minimizing risk rather than maximizing benefits. Mm-hmm. And given that scientific results might not necessarily be actually building a house, but maybe more an igloo that might melt in the spring. Can we really expect people to trust science faithfully and blindly? And should we not also revise the actual role that science should take in daily life and management based on the fact that it's not necessarily matching those needs in terms of the time scale?
Yeah. I think I grasp where you're going with this, because can we expect people to blindly accept science? Absolutely not. I don't think we can simply present our results and think we've done the job. We also have to teach people how do those results get formed. And granted, a journalist may not print it, but we go for the punchline, but then we should also, but there are limitations here, because people get frustrated when they say, you know, last year they said bacon was bad for us. This year they say it's good for us. They don't know what they're talking about. And I will now use that conveniently for any science. And so if we teach people that, or try and communicate as best we can, that here are the results, here are the limitations of the results, so that they will see that it is not etched in stone. This is not the 10 Commandments coming down from the mountain. This is scientific results of a particular kind at a particular moment. And so teach people about the process as much as the outcome and why they should listen. What's the value in it? What's the benefit of having a scientific approach? Also recognizing the limitations of what science can teach us. If you're not familiar, there's a whole branch of science called scientism. Have you heard that term? It is a firm belief that the only way to understand the world around us comes from the physical sciences. No room for social sciences, humanities, arts, certainly no room for religion. I wrote an article one time, and then I said we need to recognize the limits of what science can teach us. And I said there's some things that science can't do. One of them, just among others, I said it can't explain love. And there was a professor from an esteemed university who had a rebuttal that was quite aggressive. And his response was, oh yes, science can certainly explain love because it's merely the presence of certain chemicals in your body, and we can inject those chemicals and create love. Now you snicker, but that's scientism, because your body is a bag of chemicals and I can manipulate it. A lot of people see that as what science is, and it's not. And if we recognize the limitations, if we communicate the limitations, if we present it as something accessible rather than the wisdom from on high, then we don't expect them to just take it blindly, but we take it as part of the fabric of understanding the world around us, while also respecting things like vernacular knowledge, pragmatism, other ways of understanding. If I want to understand how a farm works, I can go to local ag school, but I'd also like to talk to that farmer. That farmer has a lot of knowledge. It's quite valuable for understanding it. If I want to understand how business works, I can do it from afar. Have never talked to a business person. I don't prefer to do it that way. I know a lot of business professors who do, and it mystifies me, because business people actually have a lot of knowledge about how business works. And so I guess we just have to, I guess the final point I would make to answer your question is, can we expect, should we expect? I would come back and say, we don't have the luxury not to try. We have to find ways to communicate. We have to find ways for people to understand what science says and how it said it. And we don't have the luxury to say, I'm not going to try, because there are pitfalls along the way, there are limitations. We'll make some mistakes. We all do. You get back up and you try again. And you just keep on going, because I do think in a society that is so driven by technology issues, whether it's nanotech or GMOs, nuclear power, gun control, healthcare, I can go down the whole list. If we don't apply analysis and research to inform our thinking on these issues, we can't have a functional democracy. We're doomed, because special interests will dominate the conversation, and those who are arbiters of science and the scientific method, us, will be marginalized. And that would be a tragedy, and it would be a mistake. Thank you.